He thought forcing her onto the stage would be the perfect joke, but he had no idea he was about to destroy his own reputation. The grand auditorium of Halston Performing Arts Center shimmered under golden chandeliers, every polished surface reflecting wealth, prestige, and expectation as elegantly dressed guests filled the velvet seats, their conversations blending into a low hum of anticipation for what was supposed to be the highlight of the season, a piano performance by one of the most celebrated young virtuosos in the country. And backstage, beneath the glow of sterile fluorescent lights, Evelyn Hayes moved. Quietly, almost invisibly, her simple gray uniform blending into the background as she wiped down a forgotten music stand with careful precision, her movements unhurried, deliberate, practiced, as if she had done this 1,000 times before and expected nothing more than to finish her shift unnoticed, because that was how everyone saw her, just another maintenance worker. Another nameless presence ensuring perfection for others while never being part of it. And across the hall, Victor Langford stood tall in his tailored black suit, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he reviewed the program with a faint smirk, his reputation as a demanding, uncompromising conductor known throughout the industry, a man who believed excellence belonged only to those who earned it through pedigree and recognition, not to someone who cleaned floors after hours. And when the news came that the featured pianist had abruptly withdrawn, citing illness just minutes before the performance, the energy shifted instantly, whispers spreading through the audience, tension rising like a held breath as staff scrambled behind the scenes, and Victor's irritation was immediate, sharp, controlled, his jaw tightening as he scanned the room for a solution, because failure was not an option, not on his stage, not in front of donors and critics who expected brilliance. And then his eyes landed on Evelyn, standing quietly near the wings, holding a folded cloth in her hands, and something in his expression changed, a flicker of amusement crossing his face, subtle but unmistakable, as an idea formed, cruel in its simplicity, entertaining in its arrogance, and he walked toward her with measured steps, the echo of his polished shoes against the marble floor drawing the attention of nearby staff, who instinctively stepped aside, sensing the shift in power, and when he stopped in front of her, Evelyn looked up slowly, her eyes calm, steady, unreadable, as if she had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. And Victor tilted his head slightly, studying her like a curiosity, before speaking in a tone just loud enough for others to hear. "You know how to play, don't you?" The question hanging in the air not as an inquiry, but as a setup, a performance of its own, and a few nearby staff exchanged glances, some suppressing smiles, others watching with quiet discomfort, and Evelyn hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering softly. A little, her voice barely rising above the tension surrounding them, and Victor let out a short, amused breath, nodding as if confirming his own expectations, before turning toward the stage, where the restless murmur of the audience had begun to swell, and with a slight gesture, he signaled the stage manager, his decision already made, his confidence absolute, because in his mind, this would be nothing more than a brief distraction, a harmless joke to fill an uncomfortable silence. And as the curtain trembled slightly, preparing to rise, Evelyn stood still for a moment longer, her fingers tightening subtly around the cloth, her gaze drifting toward the grand piano waiting under the spotlight, untouched, expectant, and somewhere deep beneath her quiet exterior, something shifted, not fear, not hesitation, but something far more controlled, far more dangerous. And as the first call for silence echoed through the hall, the room began to settle, unaware that what they were about to witness was not a mistake, not a joke, but the beginning of something none of them would ever forget. The curtain rose with a slow, deliberate motion, and the soft glow of stage lights spilled across the polished black surface of the grand piano, drawing every eye in the auditorium toward the empty bench that waited at its center, and for a brief moment, there was only silence, the kind that carried expectation, impatience, and a faint trace of confusion, as guests shifted in their seats and exchanged subtle glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. And then Evelyn Hayes stepped into the light, her simple gray uniform stark against the elegance of the stage, her presence so out of place that it triggered a ripple of whispers that moved through the crowd like a quiet wave, and Victor Langford remained just Offstage, arms crossed, watching with thinly veiled amusement, as though he had orchestrated not a performance, but a spectacle. And somewhere in the front rows, a woman let out a soft, incredulous laugh, quickly covered by her hand, while a man leaned toward his companion and murmured something that caused both of them to shake their heads in disbelief, because to them, this was absurd, an interruption of prestige by something ordinary, something unqualified, and Evelyn walked slowly toward the piano, each step measured, her posture steady, her gaze forward, not searching for approval, not reacting to the murmurs that followed her like a shadow. And when she reached the bench, she paused for just a second, her fingers hovering slightly above the edge of the instrument, as if greeting something familiar, something long forgotten, but never truly gone. And the room seemed to hold its breath, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, waiting for the inevitable awkwardness, the mistake. The confirmation that this was indeed nothing more than a poorly chosen joke, and Victor tilted his head slightly, his lips forming the faintest smile, already anticipating the polite applause that would follow a brief and unimpressive attempt, a way to smooth over the disruption and move on. And in the balcony, a young student leaned forward, eyes fixed on the stage, sensing something different, something he could not yet explain, while an older patron adjusted his glasses, squinting as if trying to make sense of the situation. And Evelyn finally lowered herself onto the bench, the quiet creak of the wood barely audible in the vast space, her hands resting gently in her lap for a moment, her shoulders rising with a slow, controlled breath, and then, without looking at the audience, without acknowledging the tension that surrounded her, she lifted her hands and placed them lightly on the keys, and in that instant, the room shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, as if something unseen had just entered the space, something that did not belong to the expectations or judgments that had filled it moments before. And Victor's expression remained unchanged, confident, dismissive, certain of the outcome, because in his mind, this was already over, already decided. And yet, as Evelyn's fingers settled into position, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, there was a quiet precision in her posture that did not match the narrative he had created, a detail so small it almost went unnoticed, but it was there, undeniable, waiting, and somewhere deep in the silence. Just before the first note, the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the room was preparing to witness something it had not been invited to expect. The first note did not arrive with hesitation. It emerged with quiet authority, clear and deliberate, cutting cleanly through the lingering whispers like a single beam of light in a dim room. And in that instant, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the entire auditorium had been gently pulled into alignment with a reality none of them had anticipated. And Evelyn's fingers moved with a calm precision that did not belong to uncertainty or improvisation, but to memory, to mastery, to something deeply ingrained and impossibly controlled. And the second phrase followed, richer, more complex, weaving emotion into technique with such effortless balance that a few heads in the front row tilted almost involuntarily, their expressions changing from mild amusement to quiet confusion, because this was not what they had expected, not even close. And Victor Langford's faint smile lingered for a moment longer before it began to fade, not abruptly, but slowly, like a thought being reconsidered, as his eyes narrowed slightly, focusing not on the spectacle he had intended, but on the execution unfolding before him. And Evelyn did not look up, did not acknowledge the room. Her world contained entirely within the keys beneath her hands, each movement fluid, each transition seamless, as though the instrument itself was responding to her rather than the other way around. And the melody expanded, rising with a controlled intensity that filled the space without overwhelming it, drawing the audience deeper with every measure. And somewhere in the balcony, the young student who had leaned forward earlier now sat completely still, his eyes wide, his breath shallow, recognizing something rare, something real, while beside him, the older patron who had adjusted his glasses now lowered them slightly, his gaze sharpening as if seeing clearly for the first time, and the whispers had stopped, not gradually, but completely, replaced by a silence so absolute it carried weight, the kind of silence that listens, that absorbs, that respects without yet understanding why. And Victor shifted his stance almost imperceptibly, his arms uncrossing as his posture straightened, a small movement that betrayed a growing awareness he had not planned for. And as Evelyn transitioned into a more intricate passage, her hands moved faster, yet never rushed, each note landing exactly where it belonged. Her control so precise it felt inevitable, and a woman in the third row brought her hand to her chest, her expression softening, her earlier skepticism dissolving into something closer to awe. And still, Evelyn remained composed, her face calm, her eyes steady, revealing nothing of the depth unfolding through her performance. And the music continued to build, not as a display, not as a correction, but as a quiet revelation, one that spread through the room without asking permission, reshaping every assumption it touched. And Victor felt it now, unmistakably, the shift he could no longer ignore. Because what he had expected to be a brief distraction had become something far more dangerous to his certainty, something that could not be dismissed or explained away. And for the first time that evening, the man who controlled every performance on that stage found himself no longer in control of what was happening upon it, and the realization settled in. Slowly, heavily, as the final notes of the passage lingered in the air just long enough to be felt before fading into a silence that no one dared to break. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, charged, as though every person in the room was holding onto the last vibration of the final note, unwilling to let it go. And Evelyn did not move immediately, her hands still resting lightly on the keys, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if what had just happened required no acknowledgement, no explanation. And for a moment longer, no one reacted, because no one knew how to react. And then somewhere in the middle rows, a single pair of hands came together, hesitant at first, almost uncertain, before stopping abruptly, as if the person suddenly realized that applause would mean admitting something they were not yet ready to accept. And the room fell back into that same heavy silence, deeper now, more intentional, and Victor Langford stood frozen just beyond the curtain, his gaze fixed on the woman at the piano, his mind racing to reconcile what he had just witnessed with what he believed to be true, because the performance he had expected to dismiss had instead revealed a level of control and emotional depth that could not be explained by chance or basic skill. And he stepped forward slightly, his presence no longer hidden, his authority instinctively attempting to reassert itself. But even that movement felt smaller than it should have, diminished by the weight of what had just unfolded. And Evelyn finally lifted her hands from the keys, the motion slow and deliberate, and she stood, turning gently toward the audience, not with pride, not with defiance, but with a quiet composure that seemed to exist beyond their judgment. And as the light caught her face more clearly, something about her expression, about the stillness in her eyes, began to stir recognition in places it had long been buried. And in the front row, an older man leaned forward, his brows drawing together as he studied her more closely, his lips parting slightly as if a memory was forming just beyond his reach. And in the balcony, the young student whispered under his breath, barely audible, yet filled with wonder, and Victor's eyes narrowed, not in dismissal this time, but in focus, in calculation, because he had spent decades studying technique, studying interpretation, studying the subtle signatures that separated competence from greatness. And what he had just heard carried something unmistakable, something he had encountered only in recordings, in stories, in performances that had become legend. And a flicker of doubt passed through him, quickly, followed by something far more unsettling, the possibility that he had misjudged not just a person, but an entire reality standing in front of him. And the audience shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet discomfort, because the narrative they had accepted so easily had begun to unravel, thread by thread. And Evelyn stepped back from the piano, her hands now at her sides, her gaze steady, meeting the room not with challenge, but with a presence that asked nothing and yet demanded everything. And the older man in the front row suddenly inhaled sharply, the sound cutting through the silence like a small crack in glass, his eyes widening as recognition finally settled in. And though he did not speak, the realization was written clearly across his face, and Victor saw it, saw the shift, saw the understanding pass from one observer to another like a quiet current, and for the first time that evening, the man who had orchestrated the moment felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not anger, not irritation, but the beginning of something far more difficult to ignore. The realization that he might be standing in the presence of someone he had no right to underestimate. And the room, once filled with judgment, now held only one undeniable truth. They were no longer watching a joke. They were witnessing something they did not yet fully understand. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected, as if time itself had slowed to examine what had just taken place. And then it happened, not all at once, but like a quiet chain reaction. The older man in the front row rose to his feet, his movement deliberate, almost reverent, his eyes never leaving Evelyn as his hands came together in a slow, measured applause that echoed softly through the vast hall. And this time, it did not stop, because something in his expression, something in the weight of his recognition, gave permission to the rest of the room, and one by one, others followed, hesitant at first, then stronger, louder, until the applause filled the auditorium, not polite, not performative, but genuine, rising like a wave that could no longer be held back. And yet Evelyn did not react. She did not smile, did not bow. She simply stood there, still and composed, as if the sound was distant, as if it belonged to another world entirely. And Victor Langford felt it then, the full weight of what he had set into motion, because the room was no longer his, the narrative no longer his to control. And as the applause continued, he stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding attention out of habit, but this time, it did not silence the crowd, it only shifted their focus. And when he turned toward Evelyn, there was a brief pause, a hesitation so subtle that only those closest could see it, and his voice, when it finally came, was measured, careful, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Miss Hayes, is it?" he asked, though the question carried more uncertainty than authority, and Evelyn met his gaze calmly, her eyes steady, revealing nothing, and for a second, Victor searched her face, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would help him regain footing. But there was nothing to take, nothing to control, only the quiet presence of someone who had already proven everything without saying a word. And behind him, the older man stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the applause that had begun to soften. "Evelyn Hayes," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. But the name traveled, moving through the audience like a ripple, and with it came recognition, fragmented at first, then clearer, stronger, as whispers formed, as memories aligned, as stories long forgotten resurfaced. And Victor heard it, felt it, the shift in the room becoming undeniable, and he turned slightly, his expression tightening as realization began to settle in, because the name was not unfamiliar, not at all. It belonged to a figure he had studied in his early years, a pianist whose recordings were considered untouchable, whose disappearance had become almost myth. And his mind raced, connecting details, the technique, the phrasing, the unmistakable control, and suddenly the pieces aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. And the air around him seemed to thin, his confidence faltering under the weight of his own misjudgment. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, unchanged by the revelation unfolding around her, as if she had no need to reclaim anything, no need to correct the past or prove the present, because the truth had already spoken through her hands. And as the applause rose once more, louder now, fuller, no longer hesitant, Victor Langford stood in the center of a moment he could not undo, facing the quiet certainty that the woman he had dismissed as a joke was, in fact, the very standard he had spent his life trying to reach. And in that realization, the room did not just see her differently, it saw him differently too, and nothing about that shift could be reversed. The applause did not fade this time. It deepened, growing more unified, more certain, as if the entire auditorium had finally aligned in understanding. And yet beneath that sound, there was something else, something quieter but far more powerful, the shifting of perception, the silent acknowledgement that what they had witnessed was not just talent, but history standing before them in the most unexpected form. And Victor Langford remained where he stood, his posture rigid, his thoughts unraveling with each passing second, because every principle he had built his identity upon had just been challenged without a single word spoken, and he took a slow breath, his composure returning not from confidence, but from necessity, as he stepped closer to Evelyn, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearest could hear. "Why did you stop playing?" he asked, the question escaping him before he could fully shape it. And it was not accusation, not even authority, but something closer to curiosity, perhaps even respect struggling to take form. And Evelyn turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the room fading into the background as the space between them held something far more significant. And then she answered, her voice soft but clear, because that was enough. And the simplicity of her words settled heavily, not just on Victor, but on everyone close enough to hear, because it carried a truth that could not be argued, a quiet confidence that did not need validation. And Victor blinked once, the weight of that answer pressing against everything he had expected, because in his world, there was always more to prove, more to demonstrate, more to conquer. And yet she had stopped not out of limitation, but out of control, and that difference unsettled him in a way he had never experienced. And behind them, the older man stepped closer still, his voice now steady. "Certain, you disappeared," he said, his tone filled not with accusation, but with genuine wonder. 15 years ago, after the New York recital, no one ever knew why. And the surrounding audience leaned in, the applause now fading into a hush once more, drawn not by spectacle, but by the gravity of what was being uncovered. And Evelyn's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something deeper, something reflective, as if the past being spoken aloud was not something she had forgotten, but something she had chosen to leave behind. And she glanced briefly toward the piano, her gaze resting on it for just a moment before returning forward. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be lived, not performed." And the words moved through the room with a weight that no applause could match. And Victor felt them more than he heard them, because they exposed something he had never considered, that mastery did not always demand an audience, that greatness did not require recognition to exist. And for the first time in years, he found himself without a response, without a correction, without control, and the realization settled in fully, undeniable now, that the woman he had tried to use as a moment of amusement had revealed a depth he had never truly understood. And as the audience stood there, suspended between admiration and reflection, Evelyn Hayes stepped back once more, not claiming the stage, not holding the moment, but quietly releasing it, leaving behind something far more lasting than performance, a truth that lingered long after the final note had faded. The room did not return to normal. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in what they had seen, but in how they understood it. And as Evelyn stepped away from the piano, the applause that followed was no longer explosive or uncertain. It was steady, grounded, filled with a kind of respect that did not need to prove itself. And yet she did not turn back, did not acknowledge the rising admiration. Her pace unhurried as she moved toward the edge of the stage, her presence quiet but undeniable. And Victor Langford watched her with a stillness that would have been impossible for him just an hour earlier, his mind replaying every second, every note, every assumption he had made, and how easily it had all collapsed. And as she passed him, close enough for him to speak, he did not raise his voice, did not command attention, but instead said something he had not said in years. "I was wrong." The words low, almost unfamiliar in his own mouth, and Evelyn paused, not fully stopping, just enough to acknowledge that the moment existed. And she turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding that made his admission feel even smaller. And she gave a subtle nod, not as acceptance, not as forgiveness, but simply as recognition that the truth had been spoken. And then she continued walking, leaving him standing in a space he no longer controlled. And the audience felt it, the shift in power no longer hidden behind performance or position, but laid bare in the simplest of exchanges. And in the front rows, the older man remained standing, his gaze following Evelyn with a mixture of admiration and reflection, as though he had just witnessed something he would carry for the rest of his life. and the young student in the balcony leaned back slowly, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet certainty, as if a path had just opened in his mind, one that did not rely on approval or recognition, but on something deeper, something enduring. And behind the scenes, staff members who had once overlooked Evelyn now watched in silence, their expressions shifting from indifference to something far more complicated, because they realized that the person they had passed by without a second thought had carried a world within her they had never taken the time to see. And Victor finally exhaled, a slow release of everything he had held on to, his shoulders lowering slightly as the weight of the moment settled into something he could not escape. And for the first time in his career, he did not step forward to reclaim the stage, did not try to redirect the narrative, because he understood, finally, that some moments did not belong to him, and never had. And as Evelyn reached the steps leading off the stage, she did not look back, did not pause for applause or recognition. She simply stepped down, returning to the shadows from which she had come, not diminished, but complete, and the auditorium remained standing, not out of obligation, but out of something far more rare, a shared understanding that what they had witnessed was not just a performance, but a quiet restoration of truth. And in that silence between applause, the kind that lingers long after sound fades, the lesson settled in without being spoken, clear and undeniable, that greatness does not need to announce itself, and those who fail to see it often reveal more about themselves than they ever intended. Backstage, the noise of the auditorium softened into a distant echo, replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rustle of curtains settling back into place. And Evelyn Hayes walked through it all without changing her pace, her footsteps light against the polished floor as if she had done this countless times before, as if leaving a stage was more natural to her than standing on it. And behind her, a stagehand who had barely noticed her presence earlier now stepped aside instinctively, his eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, unsure of how someone so unassuming could carry something so immense. And further down the hallway, two staff members who had once exchanged casual remarks about her now fell silent as she passed, their earlier assumptions lingering uncomfortably in the air, and yet Evelyn did not acknowledge any of it, her focus steady, her expression unchanged, as though the recognition she had just received had no weight on her direction. And in the distance, the faint sound of applause still filtered through the walls, rising and falling like a tide that could not quite reach her. And for a moment, she paused near a side door, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal handle, and her eyes drifted downward, not in hesitation, but in reflection, as if she was measuring something unseen, something internal that had nothing to do with the performance or the audience left behind. And then, with a quiet breath, she opened the door and stepped outside, where the night air greeted her with a gentle stillness, the city lights stretching out in soft glows and distant motion, indifferent to what had just occurred inside. And she stood there for a second, the cool air brushing against her face, grounding, familiar, real. And back inside the auditorium, Victor Langford remained on stage, the applause still surrounding him, though no longer for him, and he turned slowly toward the empty piano, the instrument now silent, but somehow more present than before, and he approached it with measured steps, his hand hovering above the keys without touching them, as if he now understood that what had happened there could not be recreated by will or authority. And the audience gradually began to settle, their voices returning in hushed tones, each conversation carrying fragments of the same realization, the same question: how had they not known? How had they not seen? And the older man in the front row remained seated now, his gaze fixed on the stage, replaying every note in his mind as if committing it to memory, while the young student in the balcony sat quietly, his earlier excitement transformed into something deeper, something more focused, as though a new standard had just been set in his understanding of what it meant to truly master something. And backstage, words spread quickly, names being spoken, stories being recalled, pieces of a past that suddenly felt very present, and yet none of it reached Evelyn, not because it could not, but because she had already stepped beyond it, choosing distance over attention, meaning over recognition. And as she began to walk down the quiet sidewalk, the soft glow of streetlights guiding her path, There was no urgency in her movement, no need to hold on to the moment she had just left behind, because for her, it was never about proving anything to anyone. And inside, Victor finally lowered his hand, stepping back from the piano with a quiet understanding that the stage he had commanded for so long had revealed something he could not control, something that existed beyond his reach. And as the final echoes of applause faded into memory, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that the greatest performances are not always given for the world to see, but when they are, they have the power to change everything in a single, silent moment. The city carried on as it always did, indifferent to revelations that had quietly reshaped the lives of those inside the grand hall. And Evelyn Hayes walked beneath the soft glow of streetlights with the same steady rhythm she had carried through the evening, her hands now tucked lightly into the pockets of her coat, her gaze forward, unburdened by the weight of recognition that had begun to ripple behind her and inside the auditorium. Conversations lingered long after the final note had faded. Not loud, not chaotic, but thoughtful, measured, as if each person was trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they believed they understood about talent, status, and worth. And Victor Langford remained near the stage long after most had begun to leave, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the piano. A man who had built his life on certainty, now standing in the quiet aftermath of something that had dismantled it without resistance. And he exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the vastness of the room, because there was no audience left to impress, no performance left to conduct, only the lingering presence of a truth he could not ignore. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for control, he did not correct or justify. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist as it was, complete and unaltered. And in the front rows, the older man finally rose from his seat, adjusting his coat with a thoughtful expression, as though he carried something new with him, something he had not expected to find that evening. While the young student in the balcony paused before leaving, his eyes drifting once more toward the empty stage, his mind quietly reshaping his understanding of what it meant to pursue excellence, not for applause, but for something deeper, something lasting. And as the doors of the auditorium closed one by one, the echoes of the evening settled into memory, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet correction, a reminder that greatness often moves unnoticed until the moment it chooses to reveal itself. And outside, Evelyn reached a quiet corner where the city noise softened into a distant hum, and she stopped for a moment, not to reflect on the audience or the applause, but simply to stand in the stillness, her breath steady, her presence grounded, as if nothing had changed, because for her, nothing needed to change. She had never lost what others had only just discovered. And as she continued on her way, her figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the night, the story she left behind did not follow her. It remained with those who had witnessed it, reshaping their perceptions in ways they would not soon forget. And in that quiet separation between who she was and what they had finally seen, one truth remained, steady and unspoken, that dignity does not demand recognition to exist, and the moment it is revealed, it leaves an imprint far greater than applause could ever hold. And that night, without announcement, without spectacle, the world inside that room remembered what true mastery and true humility truly look like.